Lady Eleanor's tea service was legendary throughout the kingdom, with nobles queuing for her special blends. No one noticed that those who received invitations died within a week. The truth hidden among the tea leaves would reveal that courtesy could be the deadliest weapon of all. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's begin our journey together tonight. The morning fog lifted from Thornfield Manor like silk curtains drawn back to reveal a stage set for perfection. Lady Eleanor Ashworth emerged from her rose garden carrying a wicker basket filled with herbs and flowers that would soon become the foundation of the afternoon's entertainment. Her movements possessed the fluid grace of someone born to aristocracy, every gesture calculated to embody the ideals of feminine refinement that Victorian society held most dear. At 32, Lady Eleanor had achieved a reputation that transcended the ordinary boundaries of social distinction. She was not merely wealthy, beautiful, or well-connected. She was the undisputed mistress of the domestic arts, particularly the ancient ritual of afternoon tea. Her gatherings at Thornfield Manor had become the most coveted invitations in the kingdom, with nobles traveling hundreds of miles for the privilege of experiencing what many considered the finest tea service in all of Europe. The manor itself seemed designed as the perfect setting for Lady Eleanor's social artistry. Built in the previous century by her late husband's family, Thornfield combined architectural grandeur with intimate elegance that made every guest feel simultaneously honored and comfortable. The morning room where she held her famous tea parties faced east toward gardens that provided a stunning backdrop of seasonal color, while tall windows filled the space with natural light that made even the plainest guest appear radiant. But it was Lady Eleanor's tea itself that had elevated her gatherings from mere social events to experiences that bordered on the transcendent. Her blends were unique creations that combined traditional English breakfast teas with exotic herbs and flowers sourced from the most remote corners of the empire. Each cup delivered flavors that seemed to evolve with every sip, creating sensory experiences that guests found impossible to replicate despite their most determined efforts. The secret of Lady Eleanor's extraordinary blends lay not in the exotic ingredients themselves, but in her profound understanding of botanical chemistry that few outside the scientific community possessed. Her extensive library contained volumes on herbalism that dated back centuries, including several rare manuscripts that described the properties of plants in terms that conventional horticulture would have deemed dangerous or impossible. Duchess Margaret Pemberton had been among the first to experience the full impact of Lady Eleanor's hospitality. A formidable woman whose sharp tongue and political connections made her one of the most influential figures in the kingdom, she had initially approached Thornfield Manor with the skeptical attitude of someone accustomed to disappointment by provincial entertainments. Her transformation during that first tea party had been remarkable to witness. The Duchess had arrived at Thornfield with her characteristic air of barely concealed boredom, prepared to endure what she assumed would be another tedious afternoon of vapid conversation and inferior refreshments. Lady Eleanor had received her with perfect courtesy, neither deferential nor presumptuous, striking exactly the right balance to put even the most demanding guest at ease. The tea service itself had been flawless. Delicate spode china painted with patterns that seemed to shift in the afternoon light, silver that reflected the garden's colors like captured rainbows, and pastries arranged with artistic precision that made them almost too beautiful to consume. But it was the tea itself that had captured the Duchess's attention completely. Lady Eleanor had prepared a special blend in honor of her distinguished guest, a combination she described as Himalayan morning mist with whispers of ancient gardens. The flavor had been unlike anything Duchess Margaret had ever experienced, simultaneously familiar and exotic, comforting yet stimulating, with subtle notes that seemed to unlock memories of places she had never visited and experiences she had never lived. The conversation that followed had been equally remarkable. Lady Eleanor possessed the rare gift of making her guests feel as though they were the most fascinating people she had ever encountered, drawing out stories and opinions with questions that demonstrated both genuine interest and sophisticated understanding. The Duchess had found herself sharing confidences that she had never revealed to her closest friends, while feeling completely secure in Lady Eleanor's discretion. When the afternoon concluded, Duchess Margaret had felt more refreshed and energized than she had in years. The combination of Lady Eleanor's perfect hospitality and her extraordinary tea had created an experience that seemed to restore both body and spirit in ways that conventional entertainment never achieved. She had departed Thornfield Manor with promises to return soon and recommendations to share Lady Eleanor's hospitality with her most exclusive social circle. The Duchess's enthusiasm had proven infectious among her acquaintances, creating demand for invitations to Thornfield Manor that far exceeded Lady Eleanor's capacity to accommodate. The exclusivity this created only enhanced the prestige associated with her tea parties, transforming them from pleasant social gatherings into symbols of ultimate social achievement. But Duchess Margaret's advocacy for Lady Eleanor's hospitality had been tragically brief. Within a week of her visit to Thornfield Manor, she had begun experiencing symptoms that her physicians initially attributed to the strain of an unusually active social season. Fatigue and digestive distress had gradually intensified into more serious complications that resisted all conventional treatments. The Duchess's decline had been swift, but seemingly natural, following patterns that her medical attendants recognized from other cases involving women of advanced age and active lifestyle. Her death, while sudden, had been attributed to heart failure, brought on by the accumulated stresses of a life spent in demanding social and political activities. The funeral had been attended by the highest levels of society, including Lady Eleanor, who had sent a magnificent wreath of exotic flowers with a note expressing her deep sorrow at the loss of such a remarkable woman. No one had thought to connect the Duchess's death with her recent visit to Thornfield Manor. The timing seemed coincidental rather than causal, particularly given Lady Eleanor's reputation for perfect hospitality and genuine care for her guests' welfare. If anything, the tragedy had enhanced sympathy for Lady Eleanor, who had lost not only a distinguished guest, but also one of her most effective advocates. The pattern that would eventually emerge had been invisible in its initial manifestation. Duchess Margaret's death had seemed like an isolated tragedy, the kind of unexpected loss that reminded everyone of life's fragility and unpredictability. Lady Eleanor's grief had appeared entirely genuine, her sorrow at losing someone who had appreciated her hospitality so deeply touching those who witnessed her emotional response. The second invitation that Lady Eleanor extended, to Lord Reginald Hartwell, had been accepted with enthusiasm that reflected both his own social ambitions and the recommendations he had received from mutual acquaintances who had heard Duchess Margaret's praise for Thornfield Manor's legendary tea service. Lord Hartwell was a man whose appreciation for life's finer pleasures had made him an eager participant in any gathering that promised exceptional entertainment. His visit to Thornfield Manor had followed the same pattern of perfect hospitality that had characterized the Duchess's experience. Lady Eleanor had prepared another unique blend specifically for his visit, this one described as Ceylon sunrise with notes of ancient spice roots. The tea had delivered the same extraordinary sensory experience that had captivated previous guests, while the conversation had flowed with the ease that marked Lady Eleanor's gift for making even the most ordinary visitor feel fascinating and important. Lord Hartwell had departed Thornfield Manor in a state of euphoria that he attributed to Lady Eleanor's remarkable hospitality and the restorative properties of her exceptional tea. His enthusiasm had been evident to everyone who encountered him in the days following his visit, as he regaled friends and acquaintances with detailed descriptions of the most perfect afternoon he had ever experienced. But Lord Hartwell's advocacy for Lady Eleanor's tea parties had been as brief as the Duchess's. Within days of his visit, he had begun experiencing the same pattern of symptoms that had preceded Duchess Margaret's decline. The progression from initial discomfort to serious illness to unexpected death had followed an almost identical timeline, though his physicians had attributed the outcome to completely different causes related to his known tendency toward overindulgence in food and drink. The coincidence of two sudden deaths among Lady Eleanor's recent guests might have attracted attention from more observant members of society, but the social circles that valued invitations to Thornfield Manor were accustomed to the unexpected losses that seemed to accompany lives lived at the highest levels of luxury and privilege. Both deaths had appeared natural and explicable, while Lady Eleanor's continued reputation for perfect hospitality deflected any suspicion that her tea parties might be anything other than beneficial to her guests' health and well-being. Lady Eleanor herself had responded to these losses with the perfect combination of sorrow and resilience that society expected from someone of her breeding and character. Her genuine grief at losing guests who had appreciated her efforts so deeply had touched everyone who witnessed her emotional response, while her determination to continue hosting gatherings in their memory had demonstrated the strength of character that made her such an admired figure. The waiting list for invitations to Thornfield Manor had continued growing despite, or perhaps because, of the tragic losses that had befallen some of Lady Eleanor's most distinguished guests. The combination of exclusivity, legendary hospitality, and the poignant awareness that each gathering might be among the last experiences that participants would treasure had created demand that transformed Lady Eleanor's tea parties from social events into something approaching religious experiences. As autumn settled over Thornfield Manor, Lady Eleanor reviewed her carefully maintained guest lists and social calendars with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish. Her reputation as the kingdom's premier hostess was now unassailable, while her influence within the highest levels of society continued expanding with each carefully orchestrated gathering. The morning fog that lifted from her gardens each day revealed not merely a beautiful estate, but the headquarters of an operation that had successfully merged social ambition with methods that conventional society would never suspect or understand. Lady Eleanor had discovered that the perfect hostess could accomplish things that more obvious forms of power could never achieve, and that the most deadly weapons were often those disguised as gestures of refined hospitality. The foundation of Lady Eleanor's deadly expertise had been laid during her childhood at Millfield Abbey, where her grandmother had maintained an herb garden that served purposes far beyond ordinary culinary or medicinal applications. Old Lady Catherine Ashworth had been a woman whose knowledge of botanical properties extended into territories that the local physician found both impressive and slightly unsettling, though he had never questioned the remarkable effectiveness of her remedies for various ailments. Young Eleanor had spent countless hours in that garden, learning to identify plants by touch and smell, understanding the subtle differences between species that looked nearly identical to untrained eyes. Her grandmother had taught her that every plant contained multiple personalities, the benevolent aspects that could heal and nourish, and the darker qualities that could harm or destroy when properly understood and applied. The education had been presented as traditional feminine accomplishment, the kind of domestic knowledge that would make Eleanor a more capable mistress of her own household someday. Lady Catherine had emphasized the importance of understanding what grew in one's garden, both for the safety of family and guests, and for the practical advantages that came from being able to create remedies that conventional medicine could not provide. But Lady Catherine's teachings had extended beyond mere identification and basic applications. She had possessed manuscripts that described botanical preparations in terms that conventional herbalism would have found disturbing, techniques for concentrating and combining plant essences in ways that amplified their effects far beyond what nature had originally intended. These texts had been family heirlooms, passed down through generations of women who had understood that knowledge was power and that certain kinds of knowledge were particularly valuable. Eleanor's natural aptitude for botanical studies had impressed even her well-educated grandmother. The girl possessed an intuitive understanding of how different plants might interact when combined, along with a remarkable memory for the complex procedures that turned harmless herbs into preparations that could produce dramatic effects on human physiology. By age 15, she could create tinctures and extracts that rivaled anything produced by professional pharmacists. The transformation from academic interest to practical application had begun during Eleanor's first season in London society, when she had encountered the realities of social competition among women, whose advantages had previously seemed insurmountable. Her family's wealth and her own beauty had provided entry into exclusive circles, but maintaining her position among women who possessed greater titles, larger fortunes, or more powerful connections had required strategies that conventional social training had not addressed. Lady Patricia Worthington had been Eleanor's first serious rival, a woman whose combination of ancient lineage and contemporary influence had made her the acknowledged leader of their particular social set. Patricia's dismissive treatment of Eleanor's provincial background and newly acquired wealth had been delivered with the kind of polished cruelty that only the truly secure could achieve, creating humiliations that burned in Eleanor's memory long after the specific insults had been forgotten. The solution had presented itself during a house party at Patricia's country estate, where Eleanor had been relegated to a clearly inferior guest room while women of lesser accomplishments but greater social standing had been given accommodations that reflected their hostess's regard. The slight had been calculated to demonstrate Eleanor's marginal position within the group, a reminder that acceptance could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. Eleanor's response had been to volunteer her assistance with the elaborate afternoon tea that Patricia had planned as the weekend's centerpiece entertainment. Her offer had been accepted with barely concealed condescension, as Patricia viewed Eleanor's expertise as confirmation of her essentially domestic nature. The opportunity to demonstrate superior knowledge while making use of Eleanor's clearly inferior social position had appealed to Patricia's sense of natural hierarchy. The special blend that Eleanor had prepared for Patricia's tea service had incorporated techniques learned from her grandmother's manuscripts, combining traditional ingredients with more exotic additions that would enhance the overall flavor, while producing effects that would become apparent only after the gathering had concluded. The preparation had required careful timing and precise measurements, but Eleanor's years of botanical education had prepared her for exactly such application. The tea party itself had been a remarkable success, with guests praising both the exceptional flavor of Eleanor's blend and Patricia's wisdom in securing such accomplished assistance. Patricia had basked in the compliments, while treating Eleanor with the kind of gracious condescension that hostesses typically reserved for particularly capable servants. The afternoon had concluded with expressions of mutual satisfaction and promises of future collaboration. Patricia's decline had begun 3 days later with symptoms that her physicians initially attributed to the exhaustion that often followed successful social entertainments. The progression from minor discomfort to serious illness had been gradual enough to seem natural, while the ultimate outcome had appeared to result from complications that no reasonable person could have anticipated or prevented. Eleanor had attended Patricia's funeral with appropriate expressions of grief, while privately marveling at the precision with which her botanical preparations had achieved their intended effects. The combination of ingredients she had developed had produced exactly the timeline and symptoms that would appear most natural to medical examination, while leaving no traces that could connect the outcome to any specific cause. The success of this initial experiment had convinced Eleanor that her grandmother's teachings could be adapted to address the various social and personal challenges that conventional feminine accomplishments could not resolve. The key lay in understanding that the most effective applications were those that appeared entirely natural, creating outcomes that served her interests while seeming to result from ordinary misfortune rather than deliberate intervention. Eleanor's subsequent refinements of her techniques had focused on developing blends that could be customized for specific individuals and circumstances. Different combinations of plant essences could produce various effects, from simple digestive distress that would embarrass rivals at crucial social moments, to more serious conditions that could eliminate competition permanently. The art lay in matching the appropriate preparation to the desired outcome, while ensuring that the connection between cause and effect remained invisible to outside observation. The establishment of her tea service at Thornfield Manor had provided the perfect venue for implementing these techniques on a larger scale. The social conventions surrounding afternoon tea made it possible to serve customized preparations to specific guests while maintaining the appearance of uniform hospitality. Eleanor could tailor each cup to serve particular purposes while ensuring that the overall experience enhanced her reputation as the kingdom's most accomplished hostess. The exotic ingredients that Eleanor incorporated into her blends came from suppliers who specialized in serving collectors whose interests extended beyond conventional horticulture. These merchants maintained discreet networks that could provide virtually any botanical specimen for clients whose purposes they preferred not to investigate too closely. Eleanor's willingness to pay premium prices for the finest quality materials had made her a valued customer whose orders received priority attention. The preparation of her special blends took place in a private laboratory that Eleanor had established in Thornfield Manor's cellars, where she could work without interruption or observation. The space had been equipped with apparatus that would have impressed professional pharmacists, including devices for distillation, concentration, and precise measurement, that allowed her to achieve consistent results regardless of variations in raw materials. Eleanor's record-keeping system documented the effects of different combinations with scientific precision, noting which preparations produce specific symptoms, optimal dosages for different body weights and constitutions, and timing considerations that ensured maximum effectiveness. The accumulated data represented years of careful experimentation and observation, creating a reference work that would have been invaluable to anyone seeking to understand the darker applications of botanical knowledge. The beauty of Eleanor's system lay in its integration with social conventions that made detection virtually impossible. Tea parties were expected to involve unique blends that distinguished accomplished hostesses from ordinary entertainers. Guests who experienced minor discomfort afterward would attribute such effects to overindulgence in rich foods or the excitement of stimulating conversation rather than suspecting deliberate poisoning. Even more serious consequences could be explained by the natural vulnerabilities that affected people of the social class that Eleanor typically entertained. Wealthy individuals often suffered from conditions related to sedentary lifestyles, rich diets, and the stresses associated with maintaining positions of influence and responsibility. Deaths that might seem suspicious among younger, healthier populations appeared entirely normal when they occurred among Eleanor's usual guests. Eleanor had perfected not merely the technical aspects of botanical preparation, but the psychological dimensions of maintaining perfect innocence in the face of outcomes that served her interests completely. Her genuine grief at losing guests who had appreciated her hospitality so deeply was entirely authentic, based on her sincere regret that such measures had been necessary to achieve her larger objectives. The art of poison, as Eleanor had learned to practice it, required not merely knowledge of harmful plants, but understanding of human nature that allowed her to maintain the trust and affection of people whose deaths she was systematically orchestrating. The perfect poisoner was not someone who inspired fear or suspicion, but rather someone whose presence was associated with pleasure, comfort, and genuine care for others' well-being. As she refined her techniques and expanded her influence, Eleanor had come to understand that she possessed talents that transcended ordinary social accomplishment. Her ability to eliminate obstacles while enhancing her reputation represented a form of power that conventional wealth or beauty could never achieve. She had become something unique in her society, a woman whose greatest strength lay in appearing entirely harmless while wielding capabilities that could reshape the social landscape according to her will. The autumn social season of 1847 marked the apex of Lady Eleanor's influence within the highest circles of English society, as her reputation for exceptional hospitality had attracted attention from nobles whose presence at Thornfield Manor would establish her as the kingdom's premier hostess. The carefully curated guest list for her October tea parties read like a directory of the most powerful and influential figures in the realm, each invitation representing both a social triumph and a strategic opportunity. Lord Pemberton arrived at Thornfield Manor on a crisp October morning, his carriage bearing the coat of arms that had represented one of England's oldest families for over 5 centuries. As the kingdom's largest landowner outside the royal family, his presence at Eleanor's tea party would send a clear message to society about her elevated status and the quality of entertainment that Thornfield Manor provided. His acceptance of her invitation had been the culmination of months of careful cultivation through mutual acquaintances. Eleanor received Lord Pemberton with the perfect combination of honor and ease that demonstrated her understanding of his elevated position while showing that she was not intimidated by his presence. The morning room had been prepared with particular attention to details that would appeal to his known preferences, arrangements of autumn flowers that complemented the season, music that reflected his appreciation for classical compositions, and refreshments that showcased both traditional English fare and exotic delicacies that would intrigue his sophisticated palate. The tea blend, that Eleanor had prepared specifically for Lord Pemberton's visit incorporated elements designed to appeal to his particular constitution and circumstances. At 63, he suffered from the digestive complaints common among men of his age and lifestyle, while his position required him to maintain energy levels that his natural vitality could no longer sustain. Eleanor's special preparation promised to address both concerns while delivering the extraordinary flavor experience that had made her tea service legendary. The blend she called Earl's Morning Glory combined traditional Earl Grey with rare botanical additions that would enhance both flavor and physiological effects. The bergamot oil that gave Earl Grey its distinctive character had been supplemented with essences extracted from plants that Eleanor's research had identified as particularly effective for men of Lord Pemberton's age and physical condition. The combination would provide temporary stimulation and digestive relief while delivering more permanent effects that would manifest after an appropriate delay. Lord Pemberton's response to Eleanor's hospitality exceeded even her optimistic expectations. His enjoyment of the tea was evident from his first sip, while his appreciation for the conversation and overall atmosphere led him to extend his visit well beyond the customary duration for such social calls. By the time he departed Thornfield Manor, he had committed to recommending Eleanor's hospitality to his most exclusive social connections, while promising to return for future gatherings. The validation that Lord Pemberton's enthusiasm provided had immediate effects on Eleanor's social position. Within days of his visit, she began receiving inquiries from nobles who had previously shown little interest in provincial entertainments, but were suddenly eager to experience whatever had so impressed one of the kingdom's most discriminating figures. The waiting list for invitations to Thornfield Manor grew to include names that represented the very pinnacle of English society. Sir William Blackwood's visit followed 2 weeks later, his presence representing another significant step in Eleanor's social ascension. As the kingdom's most successful merchant banker, Sir William possessed influence that extended beyond traditional aristocratic circles into the commercial networks that increasingly shaped national policy. His appreciation for Eleanor's unique hospitality would open doors to financial and political connections that conventional social climbing could never achieve. Eleanor's preparation for Sir William's visit had taken into account both his commercial background and his known interest in exotic investments and unusual business opportunities. The tea blend she created for his entertainment incorporated ingredients sourced from the farthest reaches of the empire, along with stories about their origins that would appeal to his fascination with international trade networks. The preparation itself would deliver effects calibrated to his younger constitution and more robust health. The success of Sir William's visit had been evident in his immediate enthusiasm for Eleanor's hospitality and his promises to share the experience with his extensive business network. His departure from Thornfield Manor had been accompanied by commitments to arrange introductions to influential figures in London's financial community, connections that would provide Eleanor with access to resources that even her substantial inherited wealth could not match. But the true measure of Eleanor's success lay not in the immediate pleasure that her guests experienced, but in the carefully planned outcomes that followed their visits with clockwork precision. Lord Pemberton's decline had begun exactly 72 hours after his tea party, following patterns that Eleanor's research had identified as optimal for men of his age and constitution. The progression from initial discomfort to serious complications had unfolded according to timelines that appeared entirely natural to medical observation. Lord Pemberton's death had been attributed to heart failure complicated by digestive disorders, conditions that his physicians recognized as consistent with his age, lifestyle, and known health challenges. The autopsy had revealed nothing unusual beyond the expected organ deterioration associated with a life of privilege and responsibility. Eleanor had attended his funeral as an honored guest, her presence reflecting the genuine affection that Lord Pemberton had expressed for her hospitality during his final weeks. Sir William's outcome had followed a similar pattern, though his younger age and better health had required adjustments to both the botanical preparation and the expected timeline. His death had been attributed to complications from a sudden illness that his physicians initially thought might be related to food poisoning contracted during his extensive business travels. The lack of any clear source for such contamination had eventually led to a diagnosis of natural causes related to the stresses of his demanding professional responsibilities. The deaths of two prominent guests within a month of their visits to Thornfield Manor might have attracted unwanted attention under different circumstances, but Eleanor's careful cultivation of her reputation as a devoted hostess had created protective assumptions that deflected suspicion. Both men had spoken enthusiastically about their experiences at her tea parties, while their subsequent illnesses had appeared developed from causes unrelated to their visits. If anything, their deaths had enhanced sympathy for Eleanor, who had lost not only distinguished guests, but also powerful advocates for her social ambitions. The pattern that was emerging remained invisible to outside observers who lacked Eleanor's comprehensive understanding of her own methods and objectives. Each death appeared isolated and explicable, while the benefits that accrued to Eleanor's social position seemed like natural consequences of her remarkable hospitality rather than calculated outcomes of systematic elimination of potential rivals and obstacles. Earl Montague's invitation to Thornfield Manor had represented Eleanor's most ambitious social conquest yet, as his ancient title and vast holdings made him one of the most eligible widowers in the kingdom. His presence at her tea party would establish Eleanor as a hostess capable of attracting guests, whose social rank placed them virtually beyond the reach of ordinary entertainers. More importantly, his death would remove a potential rival for influence within circles that Eleanor was determined to dominate. The Earl's visit had proceeded according to the same patterns of perfect hospitality that had characterized Eleanor's previous triumphs. His appreciation for her unique tea blends and sophisticated conversation had been evident throughout the afternoon, while his promises to extend future invitations to Eleanor for his own social gatherings had represented achievements that conventional social climbing could never have secured. Earl Montague's death had been the most elaborate, yet involving complications that his physicians attributed to a rare condition that affected men of his particular lineage. The genetic factors that had supposedly predisposed him to such complications had been documented in medical literature that Eleanor had carefully researched, ensuring that the explanation for his demise would appear both plausible and impossible to investigate further. By the end of the autumn season, Eleanor had achieved social prominence that exceeded her most ambitious early goals. The deaths of three distinguished guests had been mourned throughout the kingdom as tragic losses of exceptional men in their prime, while Eleanor's reputation as a hostess had grown to legendary proportions. The combination of exclusivity, tragedy, and exceptional hospitality had created demand for invitations to Thornfield Manor that far exceeded her capacity to accommodate. The waiting list for Eleanor's tea parties had become a mark of social distinction in itself, with nobles competing for positions that might eventually lead to the coveted experience of her hospitality. The knowledge that previous guests had died shortly after their visits had created an element of poignant urgency that made each invitation seem potentially precious in ways that ordinary social events could never match. Eleanor had successfully transformed herself from a wealthy but provincial widow into one of the most influential women in English society, wielding power that extended far beyond conventional social connections into realms where life and death could be determined by the contents of a teacup. Her success had proven that the most effective forms of power were those that appeared entirely benevolent, creating influence through apparent service rather than obvious domination. The social season had concluded with Eleanor's position unassailable and her methods undetected, setting the stage for expanded operations that would cement her influence while eliminating any remaining obstacles to her continued ascension. The art of social murder had been perfected, creating possibilities that would reshape English society according to Eleanor's will. The spring of 1848 brought with it an unusual visitor to the village of Little Thornton, where Thornfield Manor's growing reputation had begun attracting attention from quarters that Lady Eleanor had not anticipated. Miss Sarah Whitmore arrived quietly at the local inn, introducing herself as a botanical researcher from Edinburgh University who had come to study the region's native plant life for an academic survey. Her modest appearance and scholarly credentials earned her little notice from the local population, who had grown accustomed to occasional visitors drawn by the area's natural beauty. Sarah's true purpose, however, extended far beyond academic botany. As the younger sister of Marcus Whitmore, a physician whose practice included several families affected by the recent deaths of prominent nobles, she had been disturbed by patterns that conventional medical thinking could not adequately explain. Three distinguished men, all in apparent good health, had died within weeks of attending social gatherings at the same country estate. The coincidence seemed unlikely enough to merit investigation by someone with the scientific training to recognize what ordinary observers might miss. Dr. Whitmore's concerns had been heightened by his examination of Lord Pemberton's final illness, which had presented symptoms that seemed inconsistent with the heart failure that had been listed as the official cause of death. The combination of digestive distress, neurological symptoms, and cardiovascular collapse had reminded him of cases he had studied involving certain plant toxins, though he had found no evidence of how such substances might have been administered to a man of Lord Pemberton's careful habits and protected lifestyle. Sarah's botanical expertise had made her the ideal investigator for suspicions that conventional medicine could not address through normal channels. Her academic credentials provided legitimate reasons for studying the local flora, while her scientific training enabled her to recognize plant varieties and preparations that might escape notice from less specialized observers. If someone in the region was using botanical knowledge for harmful purposes, Sarah was uniquely qualified to detect the evidence. Her preliminary investigations had focused on identifying the suppliers who provided exotic plants and botanical materials to collectors in the region. The network of merchants who specialized in rare specimens had proven surprisingly extensive, with several dealers maintaining discreet relationships with clients whose purposes they preferred not to investigate too closely. Sarah's careful inquiries had revealed that one particular customer had been making substantial purchases of unusual plants over the past several years. The customer in question was Lady Eleanor Ashworth of Thornfield Manor, whose reputation as an accomplished hostess had apparently extended to an interest in creating unique tea blends that required exotic ingredients. The quantities and varieties of her purchases had suggested someone with sophisticated knowledge of botanical properties, while the secrecy surrounding her suppliers had indicated purposes that extended beyond ordinary culinary applications. Sarah's decision to seek a direct invitation to one of Lady Eleanor's famous tea parties had required careful planning and strategic positioning within local social networks. Her academic credentials and family connections had eventually secured an introduction through mutual acquaintances, leading to the coveted invitation that would provide access to Thornfield Manor's legendary hospitality while allowing Sarah to observe Lady Eleanor's methods firsthand. The invitation itself had arrived on the distinctive shimmering paper that had become Lady Eleanor's signature, perfumed with exotic flowers and written in the elegant script that reflected her attention to every detail of social presentation. The honor of being selected for such an exclusive gathering had been acknowledged by everyone who learned of Sarah's good fortune, with several local residents expressing envious admiration for her remarkable social success. Lady Eleanor had received Sarah with the perfect combination of curiosity and courtesy that characterized her treatment of first-time guests, expressing genuine interest in Sarah's botanical research while skillfully drawing out information about her background and interests. The conversation had been so naturally engaging that Sarah had initially found it difficult to maintain the scientific objectivity necessary for her investigative purposes. The tea service itself had been everything that Sarah had expected based on the legendary accounts she had heard from previous guests. The morning room's elegant appointments, the exquisite china service, and the perfectly prepared refreshments had created an atmosphere that seemed to justify every superlative that had been applied to Lady Eleanor's hospitality. Most importantly, the tea blend that had been prepared specifically for Sarah's visit had delivered flavors that seemed to transcend ordinary sensory experience. But Sarah's botanical training had enabled her to detect subtleties in the tea's composition that would have escaped less specialized palates. Beneath the dominant flavors of traditional English breakfast tea and bergamot, she had identified traces of plants that had no legitimate place in conventional tea blending. Several of the exotic additions possessed properties that she recognized from her academic study of toxic botanicals, combinations that could produce serious physiological effects when consumed in sufficient quantities. The realization that she was drinking a potentially lethal preparation had required all of Sarah's scientific discipline to conceal from her gracious hostess. Lady Eleanor's continued attention and apparent concern for Sarah's enjoyment of the tea had made it clear that any suspicious behavior would be immediately detected and addressed. Sarah had been forced to continue the performance of a delighted guest, while mentally cataloging the specific plants she could identify and estimating their likely effects on human physiology. The afternoon had proceeded according to the familiar patterns that Sarah had observed in accounts from previous guests, with Lady Eleanor demonstrating the combination of intellectual sophistication and personal warmth that had made her such an admired figure in society. The conversation had touched on botanical subjects that revealed Lady Eleanor's impressive knowledge of plant properties, though she had carefully avoided discussing the specific applications that Sarah's research had revealed to be possible. As the tea party concluded and Sarah prepared to depart Thornfield Manor, she had experienced the same sense of euphoria and gratitude that had characterized previous guests' descriptions of their experiences. The combination of Lady Eleanor's perfect hospitality and the psychoactive effects of her botanical preparations had created an artificial sense of well-being that made it difficult to maintain objective judgment about what had actually transpired. But Sarah's scientific training had prepared her to recognize and resist such influences, allowing her to preserve the mental clarity necessary to document her observations and begin developing antidotes for the substances she had consumed. Her return to the village inn had been accompanied by careful notes about the specific plants she had identified, along with estimates of their dosages and likely timeline for producing serious effects. The preparation of effective countermeasures had required Sarah to draw upon specialized knowledge that few people outside professional toxicology possessed, combining traditional antidotes with innovative treatments that addressed the unique combinations of plants that Lady Eleanor had incorporated into her blend. The process had been complicated by the need to work secretly while maintaining the appearance of normal health, since any obvious signs of illness would have attracted attention that could compromise her investigation. Lady Eleanor's subsequent inquiry about Sarah's health, delivered through a servant who had been sent to check on the welfare of her recent guest, had confirmed that the timeline for serious effects was proceeding according to expected patterns. Sarah's response, indicating that she was experiencing minor digestive discomfort but was otherwise well, had been carefully calculated to suggest that the poisoning was proceeding normally while buying time to complete her preparations. The confrontation that Sarah had planned required evidence that would convince authorities while protecting her from Lady Eleanor's likely attempts to silence her permanently. The botanical samples she had secretly collected during her visit, combined with chemical analysis of the residual tea leaves that she had preserved, would provide scientific proof of Lady Eleanor's methods that no conventional explanation could dismiss. But Sarah had underestimated both the sophistication of Lady Eleanor's security arrangements and the depth of her commitment to protecting her operation. The attempt to contact local authorities had been intercepted by networks that Lady Eleanor had carefully cultivated among officials whose discretion could be purchased or whose silence could be ensured through other means. Lady Eleanor's final invitation to Sarah, ostensibly offering a second opportunity to experience her hospitality while expressing concern about Sarah's recent health problems, had been accompanied by subtle threats that made clear the consequences of refusing such gracious attention. Sarah's choice had been reduced to accepting certain death through public exposure of her investigation, or probable death through another carefully orchestrated tea party. Sarah's decision to accept the invitation had been based on her calculation that Lady Eleanor's confidence in her methods might create opportunities for exposure that direct confrontation could never achieve. The final tea party would provide the perfect setting for revealing the truth about Thornfield Manor's legendary hospitality, even if such revelation came at the ultimate personal cost. The morning of the final garden party had dawned with unusual clarity, as if nature itself were preparing to witness the conclusion of Lady Eleanor's remarkable career. The setting had been arranged in Thornfield Manor's rose garden, where exotic blooms provided a backdrop that seemed almost too perfect for the final act of such an elaborate drama. Lady Eleanor had received Sarah with the same gracious hospitality that had characterized their previous encounter, though both women had understood that this gathering would resolve questions that polite conversation could never address. The tea service had been prepared with special attention to details that reflected Lady Eleanor's appreciation for occasions that demanded her most accomplished artistry. The blend that Lady Eleanor had created for this final entertainment had incorporated the most exotic and potent botanical specimens in her collection. a preparation that she described with obvious pride as her masterpiece of floral artistry. The combination included rare orchid essences from the deepest jungles of Burma, nightshade derivatives from the highlands of Scotland, and toxic mushroom extracts that she had cultivated in the manor's specially prepared cellars. Sarah had accepted the cup with steady hands, maintaining the performance of grateful guest, while mentally preparing for the effects that would follow consumption of such a concentrated mixture of lethal substances. Her scientific knowledge had enabled her to estimate that this final blend contained enough toxic material to kill several people, administered with the confidence of someone who no longer felt the need for subtle timing or plausible natural explanations. The conversation that had followed Sarah's first sip had been unlike any that had preceded it at Thornfield Manor's previous gatherings. Lady Eleanor had abandoned the pretense of innocent hospitality, speaking instead with the frank appreciation of one professional acknowledging another's expertise. She had described her botanical innovations with the pride of an artist discussing her greatest achievements, while expressing genuine regret that such knowledge would be lost with Sarah's inevitable death. Sarah's response had been to reveal the extent of her own preparations, explaining how her scientific training had enabled her to recognize and counteract the poisons that Lady Eleanor had administered during their previous encounter. The antidotes that she had developed and consumed before arriving at Thornfield Manor would protect her from the current blend's effects, while the evidence she had gathered would ensure that Lady Eleanor's methods would be exposed regardless of the afternoon's outcome. But Lady Eleanor's reaction to this revelation had demonstrated the comprehensive nature of her planning and the thoroughness of her preparation for such contingencies. Sarah's investigation had been monitored from its beginning, her communications intercepted, and her evidence neutralized through networks that Lady Eleanor had cultivated over years of successful operations. The authorities who might have acted on Sarah's discoveries had been either purchased or eliminated, while the scientific community that might have validated her findings had been convinced that her work represented the fantasies of an unstable mind. Lady Eleanor's explanation of these countermeasures had been delivered with the calm satisfaction of someone who had anticipated every possible threat to her operations. Sarah's antidotes, while scientifically sound, had been designed to address the botanical preparations that Lady Eleanor had used in her previous tea blends. The final mixture contained entirely different combinations of toxic substances, compounds that would prove lethal regardless of the protective measures that Sarah had taken. The effects of the final blend had begun manifesting within minutes of consumption, producing symptoms that Sarah's scientific training enabled her to recognize but not prevent. The combination of neurological and cardiovascular toxins had been calculated to create a death that would appear natural while ensuring that no evidence of poisoning could be detected through conventional post-mortem examination. But Lady Eleanor's greatest triumph had been psychological rather than merely physical. As Sarah's consciousness faded, she had been forced to acknowledge the complete superiority of Lady Eleanor's methods and the futility of conventional investigation against someone who had perfected the integration of social position with scientific murder. The final tea party had demonstrated that knowledge alone was insufficient against an opponent who possessed both expertise and institutional protection. Sarah's death had been attributed to complications from a rare genetic condition that her family's medical history had supposedly predisposed her to develop. The official investigation had concluded that her visit to Thornfield Manor had been coincidental to her demise, while Lady Eleanor's grief at losing such a promising young scientist had been acknowledged as entirely genuine and appropriate. The elimination of Sarah's investigation had removed the last potential threat to Lady Eleanor's operations, while demonstrating her ability to neutralize even the most sophisticated opposition. Her position within English society had been secured not merely through successful social climbing, but through the systematic removal of anyone capable of exposing her methods or challenging her influence. Lady Eleanor's final garden party had concluded with her victory complete and her secrets protected. The tea service that had begun as social ambition had evolved into something far more significant, a perfect system for reshaping society according to her will, while maintaining the appearance of innocuous domestic entertainment. As the afternoon sun set over Thornfield Manor's gardens, Lady Eleanor had reviewed her accomplishments with satisfaction that transcended mere social or financial success. She had created something unique in human history, a method for wielding absolute power while appearing entirely powerless, for committing perfect murders while enhancing her reputation as the most caring and gracious hostess in the kingdom. The waiting list for invitations to her tea parties remained longer than ever, filled with names representing the highest levels of English society. Each future gathering would provide new opportunities to eliminate rivals, silence critics, or simply demonstrate the extent of her capabilities to those who might consider challenging her authority. Lady Eleanor had achieved more than social prominence. She had established herself as the ultimate arbiter of life and death within her sphere of influence, wielding power that kings would envy while maintaining the perfect disguise of feminine domesticity. Her tea service had become the most dangerous invitation in the kingdom, though none who received it would ever suspect that their hostess's greatest pleasure came not from their enjoyment of her hospitality, but from their inevitable destruction. The art of social murder had been perfected at Thornfield Manor, creating a legacy that would endure as long as human ambition created demand for the elimination of inconvenient obstacles. Lady Eleanor's triumph was complete, her methods undetectable, and her future secure in the knowledge that the perfect weapon was one that appeared to be an act of kindness. The tea parties would continue indefinitely, each one adding to Lady Eleanor's power while removing potential threats to her continued dominance. She had discovered that the most effective way to rule society was not through obvious authority, but through the careful application of lethal hospitality, one perfectly prepared cup at a time.